The airport buzzed with the familiar tension of hurried travelers, a constant hum of movement and urgency. Among the bustling crowd, a young girl named Lena stood near the boarding gate, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. This was her first time traveling alone, heading home after a few days at a leadership conference for teenagers. The chaotic symphony of the airport surrounded her, the squeak of suitcase wheels rolling across the polished floor, the beep of intercom announcements, and the scattered snippets of conversation from strangers. Lena wore a neatly pressed button-down shirt and a pair of jeans. She clutched her ticket and passport tightly, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She was well aware of her father's prominence in society, but he had always taught her that a person's worth was not defined by wealth or status, that humility cost nothing. Still, she couldn't shake a flicker of unease whenever she was in a public space where no one knew who she was, or more importantly, who her father happened to be. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of his words. Good character and kindness are the most valuable things a person can carry. Steeling herself, she approached the gate counter with a polite smile. Behind the counter stood a flight attendant with a name tag that read Karen. But instead of returning Lena's greeting, Karen barely acknowledged her. Her lips tightened as she took the ticket, her gaze briefly flickering over Lena's face, pausing on her neatly braided hair, before settling on the name printed on the boarding pass. "Are you traveling alone?" Karen's voice was sharp. "Yes, ma'am," Lena replied softly, keeping her tone respectful. "I'm heading home to see my family." Karen's gaze swept from Lena's head to toe, her expression unreadable yet unmistakably judgmental. Lena had encountered looks like this before, fleeting but loaded glances that carried unspoken assumptions. Usually she brushed them off, refusing to let them define her. There was no reason to expect today would be any different. She handed over her passport, waiting for the usual routine of seat checks and identity confirmation. Karen gave a quick nod as she returned the passport, but instead of moving on, she stared at the ticket again, her brows knitting together as though she had discovered something suspicious. Lena immediately sensed the shift in Karen's demeanor. A strange tension filled the air. Something was definitely wrong. Hello and welcome to Soul Deep Stories. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know which country you're listening from. Karen's face hardened, her posture stiffening. Her eyes remained locked on the ticket. It reminded Lena of her elementary school teachers. Those who had doubted her abilities, who had scrutinized her work more than necessary, as if they expected her to fail. A wave of unease crept through her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She didn't want to cause a scene. Karen pursed her lips, her voice cold and firm. "This ticket doesn't look valid." Lena's brow furrowed as she glanced at the boarding pass still clutched in the attendant's hand. "It's definitely valid," she said firmly. "I double-checked everything before I left the conference this morning." Karen's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but her voice only grew louder. "It doesn't look valid to me." A few heads turned at the sharpness of her tone. The usual hum of the terminal remained, but now, there was an undercurrent of curiosity. Travelers nearby stole quick glances, pausing in their hurried movements. Lena felt heat rise to her face, not just from embarrassment but from frustration. She exhaled slowly, determined to stay calm. "This ticket was booked through my father's office," she explained, keeping her voice level. "If there's an issue, I'm happy to." Karen cut her off with a dismissive wave of her hand, her lips twisting in a smirk. "Sure it was." Her gaze darkened, her stance almost triumphant. "Don't try to pull a fast one. I've seen plenty of passengers like you trying to get on flights they don't deserve." Lena's stomach twisted. "Passengers like you." The words struck deep, confirming the suspicion that had been growing inside her. She thought of her father's warnings, of moments like this, when people would judge her before knowing anything about her. Still, she refused to let her voice waver. "I promise you this is a legitimate ticket," she said steadily. "Maybe you could scan it again instead of just looking at it." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes as if the suggestion was absurd. A tense silence followed. Lena could hear the rush of her own heartbeat, the sound drumming in her ears. Then, without warning, Karen's expression hardened. In one swift, shocking motion, she tore the ticket in half. The sharp rip of paper cut through the air, louder than the surrounding chatter. Lena's breath caught. "What are you doing?" "That's my ticket," she gasped, her voice rising in disbelief. Karen didn't even blink. She simply tossed the torn pieces aside and folded her arms. "Move along, little girl. I'm not letting you board with a fraudulent ticket. Go find another flight, if you can afford it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some travelers whispered amongst themselves, while a few exchanged looks of concern. A couple of bystanders shifted forward, as if considering stepping in. Lena barely noticed them. Her hands trembled as she reached down and picked up the torn halves of her ticket, her mind racing. She had prepared for many things while traveling alone, but not for this. Not for someone ripping away her right to be here as if she didn't belong. Lena's face burned, not just with embarrassment, but with a simmering anger that threatened to overpower her usual composure. She clutched the torn halves of her ticket, her fingers tightening around the paper as if willing it to mend itself. Words swelled in her throat, but they wouldn't come out. She could call her father. He could fix this in an instant. But the idea of drawing attention to herself that way made her hesitate. She had always wanted to stand on her own, to prove she could handle things without relying on his name. But this was beyond anything she had ever experienced. She had every right to stand up for herself. She opened her mouth to protest, but Karen had already turned away, moving on to the next passenger as if Lena had simply ceased to exist. The dismissal stung almost as much as the torn ticket in her hands. Lena stepped away from the counter, her mind spinning with confusion, humiliation, and a growing sense of righteous fury. She forced herself to take a steadying breath. Stay calm. Think. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. If there was anyone who could help her, it was her father. But she didn't want to start the conversation in anger. Taking another deep breath, she pressed the call button and steadied her voice. The phone barely rang twice before he picked up. Lena? Everything all right? You should be boarding soon. His voice was calm, but she could hear the undertone of concern. She swallowed hard. Dad, there's a problem. They won't let me board. The flight attendant said my ticket was fraudulent, and she tore it. Silence. For a moment she thought the call had dropped, but then she heard her father exhale slowly. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, but there was a tension beneath it, controlled but unmistakable. Where are you standing right now? Lena quickly gave him her location. Stay right there. I'll handle this. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. Okay. Ending the call, she lowered the phone and took another shaky breath. Around her, passengers cast glances in her direction, some filled with pity, others with curiosity. A few looked away awkwardly, pretending not to notice, as if her humiliation was something too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Lena wished just for a second that she could disappear. She hated this attention, hated feeling powerless. She didn't want to fight. But she also knew she had done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, across the country, her father, Daniel Carter, sat in an office few people ever got to see. He was the quiet force behind one of the largest airlines in the world, an empire that had started as a small charter service decades ago. Over the years, he had built partnerships, expanded routes, and ensured that the company's reputation remained impeccable. But at this moment, none of that mattered. His daughter had just been humiliated at one of his own gates, and that was something he would not let stand. Daniel Carter had built his airline with integrity, ensuring that every passenger and employee was treated with fairness. His company was known not just for its modern innovations but for its commitment to decency. Over the years, he had stepped in personally during crises, ensuring that his staff felt valued and supported. Success, in his eyes, meant little if it wasn't paired with compassion. But when he heard the distress in his daughter's voice, a rare and undeniable anger surged within him. Daniel rarely used his influence as a show of power. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than status. Yet this was different. This was personal. He knew all too well what it looked like when prejudice reared its head, and he refused to let it go unanswered. Without hesitation, he pushed back from his desk, grabbed his phone, and dialed his executive assistant. His instructions were swift and precise. Then, without another word, he strode out of his office, ignoring the surprised glances of his staff. Daniel was a man of measured steps, someone who moved through life with a steady, deliberate pace. But today his stride was sharp, his jaw clenched. Within minutes, he was seated in the back of a sleek black company car, heading straight for the airport. Lena didn't know exactly what her father was doing, but she trusted him. She stood off to the side of the gate, unwilling to be pushed away. She had every right to be here, and she would not allow herself to shrink under the weight of humiliation. Karen continued assisting other passengers, her demeanor shifting into something almost pleasant when dealing with them. But every so often, when her gaze flickered in Lena's direction, the same look of disapproval remained. Lena clenched the torn pieces of her ticket, feeling the sting of injustice all over again. How had someone like Karen been put in a position of authority over travelers? Flight attendants were meant to help, to guide, to make the experience smoother for those flying. Yet Karen had done the exact opposite. She had humiliated her in public, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Lena exhaled slowly, grounding herself in her father's words he had shared with her many times before. He had always emphasized the importance of humility, of understanding that respect wasn't something to be demanded but given freely to all, regardless of status, wealth, or position. And yet, he had also warned her about the realities of the world. There will be people who can't see past their own bias, he had once told her. When you meet them, don't let their ignorance shake you. Hold your head high, handle them with poise, and always remember your worth. And if it ever comes down to it, I will always have your back. She took another deep breath, letting his words steady her. Her father was on his way. And for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a cautious sense of relief. Lena considered confronting Karen again, demanding an explanation, but the memory of the public humiliation was still too raw. Instead, she quietly moved to a nearby seat by the window, letting her eyes drift to the planes taxiing along the runway. She tried to push the anger aside, shifting her thoughts to the friends she had made at the conference. They had spent hours sharing dreams. Some wanted to become astronauts, others envisioned launching their own companies or dedicating their lives to humanitarian work. One friend had spoken about being the first in his family to graduate from college. Their passion had been infectious, filling Lena with a renewed sense of purpose. She still wasn't sure which path she would take, but she knew this moment, standing up against blatant unfairness, would help define her. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from her father flashed on the screen. "I'm here. Meet me in front of the information kiosk." Lena inhaled deeply, trying to steady her nerves. As she rose from her seat, she caught Karen's gaze one last time. The flight attendant's expression remained cold, but Lena refused to look away. Instead, she offered a polite nod, one that wasn't returned. Without another glance, she turned and wove her way through the crowded terminal. She maneuvered past rushing travelers, parents juggling strollers, and backpackers scanning flight schedules. Her heart pounded as she approached the information kiosk, and then, there he was. Daniel Carter stood tall near a digital display board, his posture composed, his suit impeccable, not extravagant, but just enough to hint that he was no ordinary traveler. The moment Lena saw him, she felt the weight in her chest loosen. She quickened her pace, and as soon as she reached him, he pulled her into a firm, reassuring hug. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he murmured, his voice steady yet filled with quiet anger. Lena swallowed the lump in her throat. "Dad, she ripped my ticket. Right there at the gate. She practically called me a fraud." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let's take care of this." Placing a protective hand on her shoulder, he guided her forward, moving with quiet authority. As they neared the gate, airport staff began to take notice. Eyes widened. Conversations hushed. Employees exchanged uncertain glances, some scrambling to straighten their postures. Daniel ignored the stares and addressed the nearest employee in a calm but firm tone. "Who is the supervisor on duty?" A hesitant hand pointed toward an older man in a dark blazer near the check-in counters. Without a word, Daniel led Lena in that direction. The man, his name tag reading Richard, looked up as they approached. His posture stiffened, his expression shifting from mild irritation to thinly veiled alarm as he recognized the man standing before him. Daniel Carter had arrived, and things were about to change. When Richard saw Daniel Carter approaching, he instinctively straightened, clearing his throat. His tone was carefully measured. "Mr. Carter," he said, trying to mask his unease, "is there something I can help you with?" Daniel's expression remained calm, but his voice carried an unmistakable authority. "Yes, Richard," he said evenly. "My daughter's ticket was destroyed by one of your employees. I'd like to know why." A flicker of shock crossed Richard's face. His gaze shifted to Lena, and that was when he noticed the torn halves of her ticket still clutched in her hands. His face paled. "Destroyed?" he repeated, as if trying to process the severity of the situation. "That's highly unprofessional." "Who?" Before Lena could answer, Karen stepped forward. She held her posture stiffly, but there was an undeniable hesitation in her stance. "I found the ticket suspicious, sir," she stated, though her voice wasn't as steady as she wanted it to be. "I have to protect the integrity of our flights." Daniel exhaled sharply and raised a hand, stopping her before she could continue. You tore up a valid ticket, he said, his tone unwavering. Even if you had doubts, there is a procedure to follow. What you did wasn't protocol, it was public humiliation. Do you understand the weight of your actions? Karen's mouth opened as if to respond, but she hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward Lena, yet she refused to meet her gaze. I did what I thought was right, she finally muttered. I've seen a lot of counterfeits. Richard, sensing the tension escalating, quickly intervened. Mr. Carter, he said, forcing a placating smile, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. We don't want to cause a scene. Lena considered objecting. Why should this be handled behind closed doors when the humiliation had been so public? But then she caught the subtle nod from her father. He wasn't backing down. He was simply choosing the most effective way to handle the situation. With that, they followed Richard through a narrow corridor leading to a small staff room behind the check-in area. A desk and a few chairs were pushed against the walls. The air felt stuffy, heavy with unspoken tension. Karen trailed behind them, her expression flickering between defiance and apprehension. Daniel motioned for Lena to take a seat, then turned back to Richard. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. I'm not here to cause unnecessary trouble, he said, but this incident cannot go unaddressed. My daughter was treated unfairly. And for the record, her ticket was paid for in full through legitimate channels. There is no excuse for an employee to behave like this. Richard nodded quickly, his hands ringing slightly. I completely agree, sir. This is unacceptable. I sincerely apologize on behalf of the airline. For a moment, Karen looked as though she wanted to protest, but no words came out. Lena watched her carefully, feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just about her, it was about the principal. Her father continued, his voice lowering slightly. Our company prides itself on treating every passenger with fairness and respect. When an employee acts otherwise, it reflects poorly on the entire airline. Richard swallowed hard. Of course, sir. We will take the appropriate steps. Lena sat quietly, watching the exchange unfold. This moment wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability. And now she wanted to see whether real change would follow. Daniel's voice remained steady as he continued, his gaze locked on Richard. Respecting passengers is not optional, it's a fundamental part of this airline's values. When an employee displays bias, it's not just an individual failure, it reflects on the company as a whole. Richard cleared his throat, nodding hastily. Of course, sir. We will take immediate disciplinary action. He then turned toward Lena, his expression genuinely remorseful. Miss Carter, I deeply apologize for what happened. This should never have occurred. We will make it right. Lena swallowed, pushing past the lump in her throat. Thank you, she murmured. I don't like causing trouble. I just want to go home. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning to Karen, his tone measured but firm. Is there anything you'd like to say to my daughter? Karen's jaw tensed. A flicker of guilt passed over her face before she let out a shaky breath. I'm sorry if I offended you. Lena studied her for a moment, letting the words settle. But something about the apology felt hollow, as if Karen was saying it out of obligation rather than real understanding. She glanced at her father, who gave her a small nod, encouraging her to respond in her own way. I accept your apology, Lena said softly. But I hope you realize this isn't just about a ticket. It's about the way you treated me. Karen pressed her lips together, gripping the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't respond, and Lena wasn't sure if it was because she truly didn't understand or simply refused to acknowledge the harm she had caused. A pang of disappointment settled in Lena's chest. She had always believed that if people were shown the right path they could change. But in this moment she wasn't sure if Karen would. Daniel took that as the final word. Richard, I trust you'll handle the details from here. Right now, I just want to make sure my daughter can board her flight. Of course, sir, Richard responded quickly. He turned to his computer, issuing a replacement ticket, this time with a first-class seat assigned. As he handed it over, he apologized once more, promising a full follow-up on the situation. Daniel accepted the ticket with a curt nod, then, without sparing Karen another glance, he led Lena out of the office and back into the terminal. As they walked, Daniel slowed, taking a moment to look at her. His expression softened. Are you all right? That was a lot. Lena managed a small, tired smile. I'm okay. I guess this is exactly what you warned me about. Daniel sighed, his eyes filled with both pride and sadness. It doesn't make it right. And it doesn't make it any easier. They found a quieter waiting area with fewer passers-by, a space where they could talk privately. Lena sank into a plush leather seat while Daniel sat across from her, watching her with quiet concern. From her vantage point, Lena noticed a few airport employees sneaking glances at her father, whispering among themselves, no doubt recognizing who he was. A sense of pride swelled within her. Her father wasn't just a successful businessman. He was someone who stood up for what was right. Yet, that pride was mixed with the lingering sting of humiliation she had just endured. Daniel leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Your flight leaves soon," he said thoughtfully. "I have a meeting back home, but if you'd like, I can fly with you." Lena blinked in surprise at the offer. The thought of having her father beside her after everything that had happened filled her with comfort. She nodded in agreement. Within minutes, Daniel had arranged for his own ticket. Together they made their way through the boarding gate. Karen was nowhere to be seen, but Richard was there, forcing a polite smile and wishing them a pleasant flight. Lena noticed the subtle shift in the way the other staff now treated them. The wary glances from before had vanished, replaced by an eagerness to assist. A flight attendant promptly guided them toward the jet bridge, while another staff member stepped aside with a respectful nod. Stepping into the first-class cabin, Lena took in her surroundings. The wide, luxurious seats, the soft fabric, the spacious legroom, so different from the economy class she usually chose. She never liked special treatment, preferring to experience the world without the privileges her father's status could afford. But this time she allowed herself to accept the comfort. She needed the space to clear her mind. Passengers continued boarding, struggling with overhead luggage, settling children into their seats, scanning seat numbers. But as more people entered the cabin, Lena felt a shift in the atmosphere. People were noticing her father. Some exchanged hushed whispers, others stole curious glances. It wasn't hard to tell. Many recognized him from business magazines or interviews. Just an hour ago, she had been treated like she didn't belong. Now, because of her father, she was being granted quiet deference. The stark contrast unsettled her, a reminder of how differently the world treated people based on perceived status rather than inherent worth. The intercom crackled, announcing the final preparations for takeoff. Lena fastened her seatbelt, sinking back against the headrest, feeling the weight of tension slowly lift. She turned to her father, who met her gaze with a reassuring smile. "Get some rest," he said gently. "You've been through enough for one day." It had been an exhausting day. Lena closed her eyes, hoping to drift into sleep, but her mind refused to rest. Thoughts swirled in her head. Would Karen truly face consequences for what she had done? Or would this all be swept under the rug, buried within the bureaucracy of the airline? A part of her felt relieved that, at least this time, justice had been served in some way. But another part of her knew that not everyone had the privilege of calling their father to step in and fix a situation. How many others had faced moments like this, alone without anyone to back them up? She finally dozed off, though her sleep was restless. Flashes of Karen's cold stare, the ripping of her ticket, and the judgmental gazes of bystanders played in her mind like fragments of an unfinished story. By the time the plane touched down, Lena felt even more drained than when she had first boarded. A gentle hand on her shoulder stirred her awake. "We've landed," Daniel said softly. She stretched slightly, forcing herself to shake off the haze of sleep as they stepped off the plane and into the terminal. The familiar scent of the airport brought back memories, of past trips, of her father picking her up after long journeys. As tired as she was, a small sense of comfort settled within her. In the arrivals area, a uniformed driver was already waiting for them. Daniel's phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages, but he ignored them, his attention fully on Lena. As they settled into the car, the city skyline stretched before them. Towering skyscrapers, flashing billboards, people moving with purpose along the sidewalks. Lena gazed out the window, lost in thought. Should she just let this experience fade into the past? Or was there a way to turn it into something meaningful? Daniel, ever perceptive, seemed to read her mind. His voice was gentle but firm. "I plan to make sure the airline reviews its policies," he said. "No one should be humiliated like that." Lena nodded slowly. "I understand," she murmured. "But maybe there's more we can do." Daniel glanced at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her mind buzzing with echoes of the leadership conference. "I met some incredible people there, people working on diversity training programs for businesses, nonprofits, even schools. What if we encourage something like that for the airline? Not just a basic, don't discriminate policy but something deeper. something that actually teaches people to recognize their biases and change their behavior. A thoughtful expression crossed Daniel's face. That's not a bad idea, he admitted. It could help, not just in preventing incidents like yours, but in shaping a better company culture overall. Lena felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe this wasn't just about what had happened to her. Maybe this was an opportunity to spark real change. Not just to prevent situations like yours but to create a stronger, more unified company culture. Lena felt a spark of excitement. I can reach out to some of the people I met at the conference, she said eagerly. I'm sure they'd be interested in helping. Daniel's eyes softened with pride as he gave her an approving nod. I'd like that, he said. Let's talk more once we're home. For now, let's get some rest. Tomorrow we'll take action. As they continued down the highway, the city lights flickered past in a mosaic of colors. Lena exhaled deeply, feeling both relief and renewed determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be people like Karen in every industry, in every corner of society. But she also believed in the power of change, no matter how small the first steps might be. When they arrived at their family home, a modest yet elegant house chosen for its warmth rather than extravagance, Lena finally felt the last remnants of tension fade away. Familiar staff welcomed them with warm smiles, their presence a comforting reminder of stability. As soon as they stepped inside, Lena's mother, Margaret, hurried toward the foyer. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw her daughter. Lena, she exclaimed, pulling her into a tight embrace. Lena melted into her mother's arms, taking in the familiar scent of home. After a long moment, Margaret pulled back slightly, studying her daughter's face with concern. I heard what happened, she said, glancing at Daniel for confirmation. Are you okay? Lena forced a reassuring nod. I'm fine, Mom. It was awful and humiliating, but Dad helped. Margaret's brows furrowed as she brushed a few strands of hair from Lena's face. I can't believe someone would treat you like that. Pause. Then she sighed, shaking her head. I'm just glad you're home safe. Daniel, standing beside them, wrapped an arm around both of them, pulling them close. We'll talk more about it in the morning, he said gently. Tonight, let's have dinner, rest, and figure out the best way forward. Lena nodded. She didn't have the energy to think anymore. Right now, she just wanted to collapse into the comfort of her own bed. Excusing herself, she climbed the stairs to her room. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar space wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. She set her suitcase down in the corner and sank onto her bed, releasing a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Yet even as exhaustion settled over her, her mind wouldn't quiet. Why had Karen been so quick to judge her? Would the airline actually hold her accountable? And how many others had faced the same treatment without anyone to fight for them? The questions lingered, weaving through her thoughts as she drifted into a fitful sleep. She dreamed of airport gates, of torn tickets fluttering to the ground like fallen leaves. But somewhere in the haze of her dreams she also saw something else. A future where she could do something, where she could help change the kind of environment that allowed this to happen in the first place. And when she woke, she knew exactly what she had to do next. The next morning, Lena woke to the gentle warmth of sunlight streaming through her window. The previous day's events still lingered in her mind, but they no longer felt as raw. She took a deep breath, pushing herself out of bed and headed for a quick shower. By the time she made her way downstairs, the scent of fresh pancakes filled the air, wrapping her in the comforting familiarity of home. In the kitchen, her mother, Margaret, stood by the stove, humming softly as she flipped pancakes onto a plate. Meanwhile, in the living room, Daniel paced near the windows, phone pressed to his ear, his tone measured yet firm. Lena stepped forward to help, reaching for the coffee canister. As she measured out the grounds, Margaret turned to her, studying her carefully. Did you sleep okay? She asked, her voice gentle. Lena forced a small laugh. More or less. Same dream on repeat, airport gates, ripped tickets, but I feel better now. Margaret sighed, nodding in understanding. You know we're here for you. Your father will handle things on the official side, but if you need to talk about anything, really talk, I'm here. Lena appreciated the offer. She gave her mother a grateful smile before glancing toward the living room just as Daniel ended his call. He walked into the kitchen, setting his phone on the counter with a serious expression. I just spoke with Richard again, he announced. It looks like the flight attendant is being suspended pending an official investigation. The airline is also planning a meeting to discuss new training procedures. Lena felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. It was a step forward, but it was disheartening that such measures were even necessary. Margaret handed Daniel a cup of coffee. I hope this leads to something more permanent, she mused. A suspension might make her think twice, but will it really change her perspective? Daniel nodded in agreement as he took a sip. Exactly. One action alone won't fix a systemic issue. But maybe we can turn this into something bigger. He gestured for Lena to join him at the dining table. Margaret brought over a plate of pancakes and they settled in. Lena took a deep breath, a spark of determination igniting within her. I'd like to reach out to some of my colleagues from the conference, she said. We could put together a program specifically designed to address bias and discrimination. If we present it to the airline's board, they might be willing to implement real change. Margaret and Daniel exchanged approving glances. That's exactly what I was thinking, Daniel said. We'll start by contacting the board members, but we'll need a well-structured proposal. A thrill of purpose surged through Lena. I can start today. I'll message my friends and see how quickly we can put something together. Margaret, cutting into her pancake, smiled warmly. I love seeing you channel your energy into something meaningful. That's what true leadership looks like. Lena returned the smile. This was no longer just about what had happened to her, it was about making sure no one else had to experience the same thing. And she was ready to take the first step. Lena smiled at her mother's words, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the previous day had been difficult, but now she had the chance to turn them into something meaningful. After breakfast, she carried her laptop to the study, settling into the familiar space where she had spent countless hours working on school projects. Without hesitation, she began typing out messages to two of her colleagues from the conference, both of whom had spoken passionately about diversity initiatives. She outlined what had happened at the airport and explained her idea for a structured training program for the airline. It didn't take long for responses to flood in. Within minutes, both friends replied with enthusiasm, eager to collaborate. They quickly arranged a video call for that afternoon. Meanwhile, Daniel made a series of phone calls of his own, leveraging his influence to arrange a preliminary discussion with the airline's board of directors. He could secure a meeting quickly, but he wanted to ensure that their proposal was as detailed and actionable as possible before presenting it. Margaret, drawing from her extensive experience in nonprofit work, offered insights on community outreach and the importance of long-term engagement. By midday, they had sketched out a foundational framework for what they hoped to achieve. When the scheduled video call began, Lena laid out the plan to her conference peers, explaining how her experience had reinforced the urgent need for real change. They brainstormed training modules that would go beyond surface-level sensitivity training, focusing instead on uncovering systemic biases, integrating real-life experiences, and encouraging interactive discussions. The goal was to create a program that didn't just inform but actively change perspectives and behaviors. Her colleagues contributed valuable insights, referencing case studies and successful models used in other industries. Lena took notes rapidly, occasionally pausing to exchange thoughts with her father, who sat nearby listening attentively. By the time the call ended, Lena felt something she hadn't the day before: progress. This wasn't just about disciplining one flight attendant. It was about the potential to shift an entire corporate culture. She knew it was ambitious to expect immediate change in a company of this scale. But she also knew that if she didn't try, nothing would ever change. And she wasn't about to let this moment pass without making an impact. Lena and her father had carefully structured their proposal to highlight the tangible benefits of the program, how it could improve employee satisfaction, reduce turnover, and ultimately enhance the airline's reputation. They had also included personal stories to illustrate the real-world impact of discrimination, though Lena had chosen to keep her own experience out of the official narrative. She wanted to advocate for change without turning the focus solely on herself. Finally, the day arrived for Lena and Daniel to present their initiative to a select group of board members. As they stepped into the sleek conference room on the upper floor of the airline's headquarters, Lena felt a wave of nerves settle in her stomach. Around the table sat 6 board members, along with a few senior executives. The moment Daniel entered, several of them rose out of respect, but he quickly redirected their attention to Lena. "My daughter is leading this initiative," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to support her, but she will be the one presenting the details." Lena took her seat at the head of the table, her father beside her. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and began. Her voice was clear and confident as she outlined the key points of their plan. She spoke about the real-world consequences of discrimination, not just for passengers but for the company's long-term success. She emphasized how a proactive, values-driven training program could set the airline apart, making it a leader in inclusivity and customer experience. Some board members nodded, clearly engaged, while others remained skeptical, flipping through the proposal with measured expressions. Then one of them, an older woman named Cynthia, leaned forward and posed a direct question. "This is an ambitious idea," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But let's talk about logistics. What's the projected cost, and how feasible is full-scale implementation?" Lena met her gaze steadily. She had prepared for this. Carefully, she addressed each concern, referencing research on how well-structured training programs could lead to long-term financial benefits, reducing employee conflicts and increasing customer trust. Daniel stepped in at key moments to reinforce the financial argument. "This isn't just an expense," he added. "It's an investment in the airline's reputation and its ability to attract and retain both customers and top-tier talent." The discussion continued for over an hour. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Cynthia leaned back in her chair and offered a small but approving smile. "This is ambitious," she admitted, "but I see the merit in it. We'll discuss it further at the full board meeting." Lena felt a rush of relief. It wasn't a final victory, but it was an important step forward. As they left the building, Daniel turned to her, his voice filled with warmth. "I'm proud of you," he said. Lena exhaled, allowing herself a brief smile. No matter what the board ultimately decided, she knew she had made an impact. And she wasn't done yet. Lena smiled, exhaling the tension that had been building inside her. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done this without your support." Daniel gave her shoulder a reassuring pat. "This is just the beginning." In the days that followed, the airline's internal investigation moved forward. Richard kept Daniel updated regularly, detailing the steps being taken. Karen had been placed on unpaid leave while the company reviewed passenger statements, security footage, and any prior complaints against her. As it turned out, Lena wasn't the first person to have raised concerns about Karen's behavior. Daniel remained neutral throughout the process, allowing the investigation to unfold properly. He believed in due process, but deep down, he also knew that no passenger should ever have to experience what Lena had gone through. A part of him quietly hoped that Karen would never be in a position to treat another traveler that way again. Meanwhile, Lena's life began to return to a sense of normalcy, at least on the surface. She attended classes, spent time with her friends, and continued her extracurricular activities. But something inside her had shifted. The moment at the airport had ignited a resolve she hadn't felt before. And she knew that once the airline board made its final decision, she would be ready to see this initiative through. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, Lena sat at her desk, flipping through pages of notes when she heard her father call her name from downstairs. She set her pen aside and hurried to find him standing near the front door, his phone in hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was a certain weight behind his gaze as he gestured for her to come closer. "It's Richard," he said quietly. "He wants to speak with you." Lena's heartbeat quickened. She took the phone and pressed it to her ear. "Hello, Richard," she greeted politely. Richard's voice carried a note of relief. "Lena, I wanted to personally inform you, the airline has completed its review. After gathering substantial evidence, they've decided to terminate Karen's employment." Lena stood still for a moment, absorbing the news. She didn't feel joy, nor did she feel pity. What she felt was a quiet sense of justice, of inevitability. "Thank you for letting me know," she said finally. Richard continued, his tone shifting slightly. "I also wanted to share something else. Your proposal was well received by the board. There's a lot of enthusiasm for implementing a formal training program. The final vote will be held next week, but from what I've seen, things are looking promising." A flicker of excitement stirred within Lena's chest. "That's really good to hear," she said, a hopeful smile forming. "I just hope it makes a real impact." Richard's voice took on a more earnest tone. "I truly believe this program can make a difference. It's unfortunate that an incident like yours had to be the catalyst for change, but I'm grateful you're using it to push for something lasting." Lena nodded. "That's the goal," she said simply. They ended the call and she handed the phone back to her father. Daniel studied her for a moment before asking, "How do you feel?" Lena let out a slow breath. "It's bittersweet," she admitted. "I don't want anyone to lose their job, but what she did was wrong. At least now, the company seems serious about addressing the problem." Daniel nodded in understanding. "Your empathy is one of your strongest qualities," he said. "But accountability matters too. You handled this with grace." She offered him a small, appreciative smile. "Let's see what happens next week." The days passed quickly and soon the day of the full board vote arrived. Daniel received an invitation for both of them to attend in person to hear the final decision. Lena felt the same nervous anticipation as before, but this time, it was mixed with cautious hope. She dressed professionally and accompanied her father to the airline's headquarters once again. This time, the boardroom was larger, filled with more executives and decision-makers. Sharp suits and polite handshakes filled the space, the air buzzing with a quiet intensity. Lena spotted Cynthia among the attendees, along with several other board members she had only seen briefly in previous meetings. A hush fell over the room as everyone took their seats. The meeting began with the usual corporate formalities, updates on the airline's quarterly performance, route expansions and financial reports. Lena sat attentively but couldn't help feeling a twinge of impatience. She understood the necessity of these proceedings, but she was eager to hear the decision on the initiative. Finally, the moment arrived. A senior board member introduced the agenda item, summarizing the context with carefully chosen words. There was a recent incident involving unacceptable employee behavior, he said in a neutral tone, deliberately avoiding specifics. This has led to a proposal spearheaded by Mr. Daniel Carter and his daughter, Lena Carter, to revamp our employee training and implement a structured program addressing bias and inclusivity. He gestured toward the materials that had been circulated to the board in advance. Lena straightened in her seat. This was it. The decision that could determine whether everything she had worked for would become reality. We'll now proceed with the vote on whether to implement the proposal across all divisions, the senior board member announced. He gestured toward Lena, silently inviting her to speak. She hadn't expected to address the room again, and a wave of heat rose to her cheeks. But as she stood, heart pounding, she reminded herself why she was here. Thank you for considering this proposal, she began, keeping her voice steady. We believe this training won't just prevent discrimination, it will foster a more inclusive and empathetic environment that benefits everyone. Employees, passengers, and the airline's overall reputation. She kept her remarks brief and purposeful, then took her seat again. A hush settled over the room. The senior board member cleared his throat. Let's proceed with the vote. Lena's breath caught as hands began to rise. One by one, board members signaled their approval. She scanned the room, her heart thudding as a few hesitated. For a brief moment, she feared the motion would be met with resistance. But then, even those who had lingered slowly raised their hands. The proposal passed with overwhelming support. A wave of relief and pride surged through Lena. The senior board member offered a small, congratulatory smile. We will move forward with the development and rollout of this program as soon as possible. Mr. Carter, Lena, we'd like to coordinate with you on the next steps. Daniel and Lena exchanged a glance before nodding in gratitude. Thank you, Daniel said. We look forward to working together on this. As the meeting adjourned, several executives approached Lena, shaking her hand and expressing their enthusiasm for the initiative. The validation felt surreal. What had begun as a humiliating moment at an airport gate had now sparked a meaningful corporate shift. One that, if successful, could set a precedent not just for this airline, but for the industry as a whole. Walking out of the boardroom, Daniel slipped an arm around Lena's shoulders. Well done, he murmured. This is going to help a lot of people. She looked up at him, gratitude swelling in her chest. Thanks, Dad. I'm just glad we're making progress. As they stepped outside, heading toward the car, Lena gazed up at the towering buildings surrounding them. Life could change so quickly. Just days ago, she had been another passenger, quietly minding her own business. Now, she had become an unexpected catalyst for something much bigger than herself. And she was ready to see it through. Lena felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The victory at the board meeting had been a crucial milestone, but she knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. In the weeks that followed, she balanced her usual responsibilities, classes, extracurricular activities, and time with friends, while dedicating herself to shaping the new training program. Her colleagues from the leadership conference eagerly stepped in, offering their expertise. Meanwhile, airline executives formed committees to oversee implementation, scheduling regular check-ins to ensure the program stayed on track. Lena found herself attending virtual meetings late into the evening, sometimes propping her laptop on her desk after finishing her homework. She was learning more than she ever expected, not just about corporate structures and policy development, but about the complexities of rolling out an initiative that would impact thousands of employees worldwide. Daniel played a crucial role in the background, tactfully using his influence to ensure the program received the necessary resources and attention from leadership. However, he was careful to step back at times, allowing Lena and her colleagues to take the lead on the creative and educational aspects. She appreciated that balance. It gave her the confidence to make meaningful contributions while knowing she still had support if she needed it. As the initiative gained momentum, the media began to take notice. News outlets picked up on the airline's new training program, with some journalists speculating about the reasons behind the sudden shift. The company's official statements remained vague, avoiding any direct mention of Lena's experience at the airport. She preferred it that way. She had no interest in public recognition or sympathy. What mattered was that the program spoke for itself. Still, word began to spread on social media. Some users pieced together fragments of the story, noting that the initiative had been spearheaded by Daniel Carter's daughter. The airline received praise for taking proactive steps against discrimination, though some details were exaggerated or misrepresented in the process. Lena also started receiving messages from strangers, people who had faced similar mistreatment from flight attendants or other service professionals. Some shared their frustration, while others simply thanked her for advocating for change. She responded thoughtfully, offering encouragement and directing them to the airline's newly revamped complaint channels. More than ever, she realized how widespread these issues were, and it only strengthened her determination to see this program through. One evening, after a long day of meetings and coursework, she sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The weight of everything she had taken on was undeniable, but so was the sense of purpose that had come with it. There was still more to do, and she was ready. One evening, after another long day of planning sessions, Lena curled up on the living room couch next to her mother. They lazily flipped through TV channels until they stumbled upon a local news segment discussing corporate diversity initiatives across various industries. Lena's attention sharpened when her father's airline was mentioned. The reporter spoke briefly about a recent incident that had served as a catalyst for the company's new program, though they didn't go into specifics. Lena listened intently, feeling an odd mixture of pride and humility. Margaret reached for the remote and muted the television. "You're doing good work," she said softly. Lena leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "It feels surreal sometimes," she admitted, "but it also feels right." The following week marked the official launch of the pilot program. The first training modules were introduced to a select group of employees, including supervisors, HR managers, and a handful of volunteer flight crew members willing to test the materials. Lena and her colleagues closely monitored the sessions, gathering feedback through surveys and recorded discussions. They made real-time adjustments, refining the approach as they went. The responses varied. Some participants reacted positively, admitting they had never examined their own biases so closely before. Others remained skeptical, questioning the necessity of the training. But overall, the feedback was encouraging. Word spread internally, and soon more employees signed up voluntarily, before the program had even been made mandatory. This growing interest reassured Lena that they were on the right track. She, Daniel, and the rest of their small team continued refining the content, preparing for the next big step, a company-wide rollout. About a month after the pilot began, the airline made a formal announcement. All employees, regardless of role or seniority, would be required to complete the training. That included executives, ground staff, pilots, and flight attendants alike. Lena took a quiet moment to reflect on how much had changed since that day at the airport, the moment Karen had ripped her ticket in half. What had started as an act of blatant unfairness had turned into something greater, a conversation, an initiative, and now meaningful action. That same week, Lena and Daniel received an invitation to attend a special gathering at an airport lounge. Employees who had completed the pilot training would be there, sharing their experiences. As Lena read over the event details, she felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. For weeks, she had been analyzing feedback forms and data, tracking progress through numbers. Now she would meet the real people behind those statistics. And that, more than anything, made this journey feel real. When Lena and Daniel arrived at the event, they stepped into a room filled with employees from all areas of the airline. People from different backgrounds and roles mingled, each wearing name tags. Some recognized Lena and approached her, some with words of thanks, others with curious questions about the program's development. One flight attendant, Maria, admitted that she had been skeptical at first. "I always thought I treated everyone equally," Maria said. "But the training made me realize that sometimes, our subconscious biases shape how we interact with people. She hesitated, then added, I caught myself being short-tempered with certain passengers, ones who reminded me of a particularly difficult experience I had in the past. I never realized how much that carried over. Lena nodded, listening intently. I'm glad the program helped you recognize that. Maria smiled. It did. Now, I try to be more intentional in how I treat people, especially when I catch myself making snap judgments. She placed a hand over her heart. So, thank you for championing this. A security officer named Malik joined the conversation, nodding in agreement. I've worked at airports for years, he said. People are always stressed, worried about missing flights, lost luggage, long security lines. It doesn't take much for things to escalate. He gestured around the room. This training gave me practical tools to de-escalate situations, to meet frustration with empathy instead of just reacting. Lena felt a warmth spread in her chest as she listened to these testimonials. As the event continued, the atmosphere became lighter. Laughter rippled through the room as employees swapped stories about awkward passenger interactions, cultural misunderstandings, and moments where they had learned something new about themselves. It was a stark contrast to the hostility Lena had faced that day at the gate. And in that moment she realized something important. For every Karen, there were dozens of employees who genuinely wanted to do better. Toward the end of the gathering, Richard, the supervisor who had initially handled Lena's complaint, approached her. He looked far more at ease than when she had first met him. This has been quite a journey, he said with a small chuckle. I never imagined we'd be here, launching something like this company-wide. But I'm glad we are. Lena returned his smile. Me too. Richard hesitated for a moment, then asked, I hear you'll be heading to college soon. Any idea what you want to major in? Lena shrugged lightly. I'm thinking about business, maybe with a minor in social impact or something related. I want to keep these efforts going, whether that's within my father's company or somewhere else. Richard nodded in approval. The world could use more leaders like you. Lena felt her face warm slightly at the compliment, but instead of brushing it off, she simply smiled. She hadn't set out to be a leader. But now she realized she was ready to be one. Lena glanced across the room and spotted her father engaged in a lively discussion with a group of employees. He laughed wholeheartedly at something they shared, his genuine warmth filling the space. A surge of affection and gratitude welled up inside her. He had always taught her to stand up for herself, and for others, when something was wrong. And now, watching him connect so effortlessly with the people around him, she realized just how much she had learned from him. As the evening wound down, the crowd began to thin. Daniel and Lena gathered their things, preparing to head home. Just as they were leaving, a manager pulled Daniel aside with a quick question, leaving Lena momentarily alone near the exit. She turned toward the lounge's wide windows, gazing out at the bustling terminal beyond. Flights were arriving and departing, announcements echoing overhead. Travelers rushed past, some excited, others exhausted. And in that moment, a deep sense of closure settled over her. The fight for equality and fair treatment wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she had found a tangible way to contribute, a way to turn frustration into action. Sensing someone approach, she turned. An older flight attendant stood nearby, not part of the official gathering. She wore a neatly pressed uniform and a kind, knowing expression. I heard about what happened to you, the woman said quietly. I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry you went through that. And I'm grateful for what you're doing. Lena's chest tightened. Most of us take a lot of pride in welcoming passengers, the woman continued. It hurts to see someone tarnish our profession. Lena's eyes glistened. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for your work. I know most flight attendants are dedicated and caring. The woman nodded, then without another word, disappeared into the busy terminal, swallowed by the steady rhythm of the airport. Lena inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle in her heart. Every step of this journey, from having her ticket torn to standing in front of executives, to witnessing real change take root, had been an emotional whirlwind. Anger, humiliation, fear, hope, and now cautious optimism. Daniel rejoined her, placing a comforting hand on her back. Ready to go home? Lena smiled. More than ready. Together, father and daughter stepped into the hum of the airport, the knowledge of what they had accomplished hanging in the air between them like an unspoken promise. Not everyone's perspective would change overnight. Not every passenger's experience would suddenly become perfect. But they had ignited something, a spark. And Lena knew that sparks, when nurtured, could grow into lasting flames. As they walked, she lifted her head high, carrying with her the most unexpected lesson of all. If one person could rip up a ticket and try to strip a traveler of their dignity, then another person could mend what was broken and build something stronger in its place. Thank you for joining us on this journey, a story of courage, determination, and the power of a single voice to spark change. What are your thoughts on this story? What stood out to you the most? Share your reflections with us. And if you'd like to read more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to follow us. Glowing Star, the journey of change always begins with a single step. Be the one who makes a difference. Glowing Star.